Welcome to Sleepy Beep. Tonight we are going to slow down together and spend some time with a single sentence. Just one. A sentence written more than 300 years ago by a French duke in a quiet room with a candle burning low, and it goes like this. Our virtues are, most often, only vices in disguise. In the Old French it reads, Nos vertus ne sont, le plus souvent, que de vices de guise. You do not need to know any French to listen tonight. You do not need to know anything about philosophy, or history, or the 17th century, or the name of the man who wrote those words. There is nothing to figure out here, nothing to solve, nowhere else you need to be. You can simply lie back, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and let this old, strange, oddly comforting idea unfold slowly in the dark beside you. Feel free to share down in the comments what time it is where you are and where in the world you are listening from. It is a small thing, but there is something gentle about knowing that all across the night, in different cities and different beds, people are settling in to the same quiet voice. Now, take a slow, deep breath. Let it fill you all the way down, and then let it go, slowly, like a tide going back out. Wherever you are, whatever kind of day you carried to get here, let yourself settle in. Let the mattress take your weight. You do not have to hold anything up any more tonight. That sentence I just read you was chosen, on purpose, to be the very first thing a reader would see when they opened this man's book. Think about that for a moment. When you write a book, the first line is the door. It is the handshake. It is the thing that decides whether a stranger keeps reading or sets you down. And this duke, this careful, wounded, brilliant man, chose to greet every single reader with the suggestion that their goodness might be a mask. Our virtues are, most often, only vices in disguise. That is what he put at the threshold. That is the sentence he wanted you to trip over on your way in. And here is the first small thing I want you to hold, loosely as you drift. There is one phrase buried in that line that changes everything. 3 little words. Le plus souvent. Most often. Not always. Most often. Nearly everyone who quotes this man forgets those words, and in forgetting them, they turn a careful surgeon into a bitter preacher. We will come back to those 3 words later tonight, near the end, when your breathing has gone slow and even, because those 3 words are the door he left open, and behind that door is something that feels less like an accusation and more like a strange kind of relief. Just hold the phrase gently for now. Most often. Not always. We will return to it. The man who wrote that sentence was named François, the 6th of his line to carry that name, the Duc of La Rochefoucauld. He was born in the year 1613 into one of the oldest and grandest noble families in all of France, and he died in the year 1680, an old man by the standards of his time, having lived through wars and betrayals and disappointments that would have hollowed out a lesser soul. And in the middle of all of that, he wrote a slim little book of short, sharp observations about human nature. The French called it, in full, the Arflections aux sentences et maxims morales. But everyone, then and now, simply calls it the maxims. The maxims. Little sentences, each one polished like a stone in a river, each one aimed at the soft, hidden place inside you where you keep the flattering story of yourself. By the final version of the book, the one he settled on in the year 1678, there were 504 of these maxims, 504 little sentences, and he did not write them all at once and be done. No, he revised this book over and over, releasing 5 different authorized versions of it across just 13 years. 1665. 1666, 1671, 1675, and then that final, definitive fifth edition in 1678. 13 years of returning to the same small book, sharpening a line here, cutting a line there, the way a jeweller returns again and again to the same gem, turning it in the light, deciding it is not yet quite right. This was not a man who dashed off some cynical one-liners and moved on. This was a man who spent a third of his adult life perfecting a mirror. And that patience matters, because it tells you the book was not written in a fit of anger. It was written with care, almost with love. Now, before we go a single step further into what these sentences say, I want to give you an image to hold as you rest, because it will make everything else land differently. I want you to understand what happened to this man's eyes, because before he was a writer, François de La Rochefoucauld was a soldier and a rebel and a scammer at the highest and most dangerous level of French society. And in the year 1652, during a great chaotic period of aristocratic revolt against the crown, in the fighting at the barricades in the streets of Paris, at the Battle of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, he was shot through the face. A musket ball, that heavy lead ball fired from those old long guns, passed across his face, across both of his eyes. And he was blinded. In that moment, in the smoke and the noise and the terror of the street fighting, the light simply went out. He could not see. And for a time afterward, he did not know if the darkness was temporary or permanent. He did not know if he would ever see the world again. Sit with that for a moment, in the softest way. A man, in the prime of his life, in the middle of a fight he had chosen, suddenly plunged into blindness, not knowing if the blindness would ever lift. And here is the quiet irony that runs underneath this entire book, the irony I want you to fall asleep holding. This man, who was briefly, terrifyingly blinded, this man who lost the light, and then, slowly, mercifully, got it back, spent the rest of his life teaching other people how to see. Not how to see the world outside, how to see the world inside. How to see the hidden motives moving in their own hearts, the ones they had trained themselves all their lives never to look at directly. A blinded man teaching the sighted how to see themselves. That is who wrote our virtues are, most often, only vices in disguise. Now I want to make you a small promise, because I know how a sentence like that can sound, especially late at night, especially if you are already tired, already carrying something heavy. A sentence like "your goodness might be a mask" can feel like a cold hand on the back of your neck. It can feel like an accusation. And if that were all this were, I would not be reading it to you tonight, in the dark, when you are soft and open and trying to rest. I would not hand you a stone to swallow before sleep. So hear this clearly, and then let it go, and let it work on you slowly. This book is not a suicide note for the human heart. It is not a man saying you are secretly evil, everyone is rotten, nothing anyone does is real, go to sleep in despair. That is how the internet loves to use him. That is the cheap, loud version. Strip out 10 brutal lines, put them over some dramatic music, call human beings frauds, and collect the applause of everyone who wanted permission to be bitter. But that is not what this careful, wounded Duke was doing across 13 years of revision. Not at all. What he was doing was closer to what a very good, very honest doctor does. A doctor does not hate your body when she finds something wrong in it. She simply refuses to look away, because looking away is how things get worse. La Rochefoucauld refused to look away from the human heart, including, and this is the part the cynics always miss, including his own. The book is a moral instrument, a tool, something you can actually pick up and use to live a little more honestly. It is a scalpel, yes, but a scalpel is not a weapon in a healer's hand. It is the thing that lets you finally see what is really there, so you can stop being ruled by it. And to see what is really there, we have to meet the one idea that sits at the very center of everything this man wrote. In French, it is called amour propre. Say it slowly with me if you like. Amour propre. It translates most simply as self-love. And I want to be very careful with you here, because this is exactly where almost everyone goes wrong, and where the whole gentle truth of tonight either opens up or slams shut. When we hear self-love, we tend to picture something ugly, a selfish person, a vain person, someone gazing at their own reflection, someone who takes the last slice, someone who talks only about themselves at the dinner table. We picture a vice, a flaw, something to be ashamed of. But that is not quite what La Rochefoucauld meant. And the difference is everything. Amour propre, as he used it, is not simple selfishness. It is not just vanity. It is something deeper and stranger and honestly more forgivable than that. It is the restless, tireless, endlessly clever drive inside every one of us to protect the self and to inflate the self, to keep the story of me safe and flattering. It is much closer to what we would now call the ego than to what we would call greed. It is not a demon crouching in the corner of your soul, waiting to make you do wicked things. It is more like an engine, a motor, a hum that never stops running, underneath everything you feel and everything you decide, always working, quietly, to keep you feeling like the hero, or at least the decent one, in the story of your own life. And here is why I keep calling it an engine and not a monster, and why I want you to hold that image as you sink deeper into the pillow. An engine is not good or evil. An engine is just power. It is a force that can drive you toward a cliff or drive you home safely, depending entirely on whether you can see it and steer it, or whether it runs you blind. La Rochefoucauld's whole project was not to shame you for having this engine. Everyone has it. He had it. He knew he had it. His project was to help you finally hear it running, so that it could no longer run you without your knowledge. Think of it like this. Imagine you have lived your whole life in a house, and somewhere down in the basement of that house, there has always been a machine humming away, day and night, so constant that you have long since stopped hearing it. It is the background sound of your whole life. You do not even know it is there, and everything in the house, the warmth, the light, the water in the pipes, all of it is somehow connected to that hum you cannot hear. La Rochefoucauld is simply the man who takes your hand, walks you down the basement stairs, and says, gently, listen, do you hear that? That has been running the whole time. Let us just look at it together. That is not cruelty. That is the opposite of cruelty. It is the kindest thing, really, to help someone finally hear the sound they have been living inside of forever. And he begins the whole book by naming the single most dangerous thing about this engine. Because after that opening sentence, that epigraph about virtues and disguised vices, the very first real observation he offers, the first true maxim of the collection, is this: self-love is the greatest of all flatterers. In the French, l'amour propre est le plus grand de tous les flatteurs. The greatest of all flatterers. Now let that one settle for a moment, because it is doing something very clever and very kind at the same time. A flatterer, you already know what that is. It is someone who tells you what you want to hear. Someone who praises you a little too much, who agrees with you a little too eagerly, who tells you your idea is brilliant and your instincts are perfect, and you were completely right in that argument. And you know, somewhere in you, that flattery is dangerous. You know that the courtier who only ever praises the king is not the king's friend. You know to be a little suspicious of the person who never disagrees with you, who always makes you feel wonderful, who reflects you back exactly as you would most like to be seen. Well, La Rochefoucauld's insight, the one that opens the whole book, is that the single most skillful flatterer you will ever meet in your entire life is not out there in the world at all. It is not the courtier, or the salesman, or the person who wants something from you. The most skillful flatterer you will ever meet lives inside your own head. It is your own self-love, and it never stops. It is with you all day. It is with you right now. It is the voice that quietly explains, after every argument, why you were the reasonable one. It is the voice that reframes your mistakes as bad luck and your successes as talent. It is the voice that, when you do something a little unkind, immediately finds 3 good reasons why it was actually fine, actually justified, actually not your fault. It is so good at its job, so constant, so seamless, that you have never once caught it in the act. You have simply believed it your whole life, the way you believe your own eyes. And that is the deep, quiet reason this book matters. Because the person best equipped to deceive you about your own goodness is you, not your enemy, not a stranger. You, your enemy at least, you know to be suspicious of. But this flatterer, this inner voice that always takes your side, you have trusted completely. Because it sounds exactly like you. It is you. And so its flattery goes down easy every single time, and you never taste the sweetness in it. I know that might sound at first a little unsettling. Do not let it be. Let it be instead a small loosening. Because think about what it would actually mean to hear that voice for the first time. To catch it, gently, in the act. Not to fight it. Not to hate it, just to notice it. Oh, there it goes again. There is the voice, explaining why I was right. There is the little machine, humming away, making me the hero. Once you can hear it, it loses its power over you. It can still hum. It will always hum. But it can no longer decide things for you in the dark, without your permission. That is not despair. That, quietly, is the beginning of freedom. And we will walk all the way to that freedom together, over the coming while, so there is no rush now. Now there is one more thing I want to plant in you tonight, before your thoughts start to soften and blur. One more small mystery to carry down into sleep, because it tells you just how honest this man really was. La Rochefoucauld, in that very first edition of his book, back in 1665, wrote his single, longest and most complete portrait of amour-propre. Not a short maxim, a long, sprawling, astonishing piece of writing in which he described self-love as if it were a living creature. A cunning, restless animal that hides in every corner of the human heart, that disguises itself endlessly, that changes shape to escape detection, and, most remarkably of all, that deceives even itself. He wrote that the greatest deceptions we suffer from others are still exceeded by the deceptions we practice on our own selves. It was the boldest, deepest, most complete thing he ever wrote about the hidden engine. It was, you might say, his masterpiece of unmasking, the one page where he cut all the way down to the bone. And then he cut it, not the page from the book. In every later edition, he removed it. He took his own most complete anatomy of self-love, his sharpest and most daring incision, and he quietly deleted it. It survives now only among what scholars call the suppressed maxims, the pieces he cut, often listed as Maxim 563, a ghost that lingers at the edges of the book he actually published. And I want you to fall asleep tonight holding that small, strange question, because we will answer it later, much later, when you are nearly gone. Why would the man who spent his life exposing everyone, the surgeon of the human heart, the one who was not afraid to write that even our kindest acts run on hidden self-love, why would that man take his own boldest, sharpest page and hide it away? The surgeon hiding his own deepest cut. There is an answer, and it is a tender one. But not yet. For now, just let the question rest beside you in the dark, unanswered, like a candle left burning in the next room. So here is where we are, as you settle deeper, as the day finally lets go of you. We have a duke, born in 1613, dead in 1680. We have a book of 504 small, polished sentences, revised across 13 years and 5 editions, arriving at its final form in 1678. We have a man who was shot through both eyes and briefly went blind, who then spent his remaining years teaching the world to see itself. We have his opening sentence: our virtues are, most often, only vices in disguise. With those 3 quiet words, most often, holding a door open that we will walk through later. We have his central idea: amour propre, self-love, not a demon but an engine, a hum in the basement of every human heart. And we have his first great warning, that this self-love is the greatest of all flatterers, the one liar you will never catch, because its voice is your own. And we have one small mystery, a page he wrote and then erased. Let us pause here for a moment, just to breathe. Take a slow, deep breath in, all the way down, and let it out even slower. Notice how the room feels around you. Notice the weight of your own body against the bed, the small warmth where you are covered, the quiet of the hour. You do not need to remember any of the names or the dates or the numbers I have given you. They will still be here. Let them float. If even one small thing has stayed with you, the blinded duke, the hum in the basement, the flatterer who sounds like you, let that be enough. You are not being tested. You are only being kept company. When you are ready, we will continue together, and we will begin, slowly, to open up the machinery of it, to look at exactly how a good and generous act can have that quiet engine of self-love humming away underneath it. All along, because this is the part that unsettles people most, and it is the part I most want to walk you through carefully, gently, so that it does not sting, but instead, oddly, sets you free. La Rochefoucauld did not simply announce that virtues are disguised vices and leave it there, like some grim slogan on a wall. No, he was far too careful for that, far too much the patient jeweller turning the stone. He showed you, case by case, sentence by sentence, exactly how the disguise works. He took the most admired human qualities, the ones we are proudest of, the ones we most want to believe are pure, and he turned each one over, slowly, in the light, to show you the hidden seam where self-love had been sewn in. Take generosity. Take the simple, warm act of helping another person. Surely, of all things, that one is clean. When you reach out to help someone who is struggling, when you give your time or your comfort or your money to someone who has less. Surely there is no hidden engine there. Surely that, at least, is pure. And this is where the Duke leans in, very quietly, and asks the question almost no one dares to ask themselves. When you help the person who has fallen, is there not, somewhere far down, in a place you would rather not look, a small, warm feeling of being the one still standing. When you are generous to the one who has less, is there not, underneath the genuine care, a faint and pleasant sense of your own abundance, your own goodness, your own place a little higher up? Not instead of the kindness. Alongside it, woven into it. The help is real, the person is genuinely helped. But the engine hums the whole time, and part of what it hums is, look at me. Look at what kind of person I am. Look how much I have, that I can give this away. And I want to be so careful here, because I can feel how that might land if you are tired and tender tonight. It is not that your kindness is fake. Please hear me. The Duke is not saying your kindness is fake. He is saying it is mixed. That the same act can be at once truly good for the other person and truly flattering to yourself, and that the flattery does not cancel the goodness. It simply travels alongside it, like a second passenger you never noticed was in the car. His whole genius and his whole gentleness, once you understand him rightly, is in that word mixed. Not fake. Mixed, and there is a world of difference between those two words, a difference we will spend the rest of our time together slowly, softly opening. So let that be the thread we pick up next, when we continue. The idea that the finest thing you did today, the kindest, the most generous, the most selfless seeming thing, might have had that quiet engine running underneath it the entire time. And that this is not a reason to feel ashamed. It is only a reason, at last, to see clearly. To hear the hum. To know the machine is there, because a man who can hear his own engine is no longer driven blindly by it. And that, though we are only at the beginning, is where all of this is slowly, patiently heading. Toward sight. Toward that strange and gentle freedom that comes not from pretending you are pure, but from finally, honestly, seeing yourself exactly as you are, and finding, to your surprise, that you can rest there after all. So breathe, now, let the names go, let the numbers go, let even the Duke and his blinded eyes drift a little further off, and let us keep going together, slowly, into the quiet machinery of the human heart. Let me tell you about the man, now, while your eyes are heavy. His name was François VI, Duc of La Rochefoucauld, born in the year 1613 into one of the oldest noble houses in all of France. A duke. Picture that word for a moment, softly, the way you might picture a candle in another room. Land and title, and a name that stretched back further than anyone could quite remember. He had everything a man was supposed to want, and he spent the second half of his life quietly taking apart the one thing money and title could never buy him, which was an honest look at his own heart. He did not shout it. He did not preach it. He wrote it down in small sentences. Little polished stones of thought, each one no longer than a breath. He called them maxims, and he gathered them into a book with a long and formal title that almost nobody uses, so we will not trouble ourselves with it either. We will call it what everyone calls it. The Maxims. 504 of them in the final and fullest version, the 5th edition, printed in the year 1678. 5 editions in 13 years. Think of that. 13 years of a man returning again and again to the same small book, adding, cutting, sharpening, the way you might return to a single letter you can never quite finish, because you keep learning something new about the person you are writing to. And the person he was writing to, in the end, was himself, and you, and me. Now here is the thing I want you to hold, gently, as you drift. This book was not a cry of despair. It was not the last note of a bitter man who had given up on everyone. It reads that way to people who only steal a line or two from it. But sit with the whole of it, the way he meant it to be sat with, and something warmer comes through. It is a moral instrument, a tuning fork for the conscience. He was not trying to prove that people are monsters. He was trying to teach a kind of seeing. The way a physician learns to read a face, or a jeweller learns to catch the flaw inside a stone that looks, to everyone else, quite perfect. And to greet you at the very door of that book, on the first page, before a single maxim, he placed one sentence, one line, chosen above all the others to be the first thing every reader would ever meet. In his own French it runs, Nos vertus ne sont les plus souvent que des vices gis. Our virtues are, most often, only vices in disguise. Let that settle. Our virtues are, most often, only vices in disguise. Now most people who love this line hear only the sharp part. Virtues are really vices, goodness is really a mask, and they walk away feeling clever and a little cold. But listen closely, because there are three small words buried in the middle of that sentence, and they change everything. Le plus souvent. Most often. Not always. Most often. He did not say all your virtues are vices. He did not close the door. He left it open, just a crack, just wide enough for real goodness to walk through. And that single phrase, most often, is the whole difference between this gentle duke and every cold cynic who has ever borrowed his words. We will come back to those three words. Hold on to them for me. Most often, when we return to them much later, in the dark, they will mean even more than they do now. And there is a second thing I will ask you to carry, lightly, the way you might carry a small stone in a coat pocket and forget it is there until your fingers find it again. Somewhere in that first edition, the very first printing, he wrote his longest and most complete piece of all. A sprawling portrait of self-love itself, written as though self-love were a living creature, cunning and restless, deceiving even the person it lived inside. His masterpiece of unmasking. And then, in every edition that followed, he cut it. He removed it. The man who spent his life exposing what everyone else hid took his own boldest, sharpest page and quietly took it out of the book. We do not need to ask why yet. Only notice it. The surgeon who hid his own deepest incision. We will find that missing page again further into the night. But first, this duke. Because to understand the coolness in his eyes, you have to understand what happened to his eyes in the year 1652, in the streets of Paris, in a season of revolt and barricades. At the fighting near the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, La Rochefoucauld was shot through the face. A musket ball passed across both of his eyes, and for a time he could not see. He believed he might never see again. A nobleman, a soldier, a man who had risked everything for love and ambition, and lost, lying in the dark, blinded, waiting to learn whether the light would ever come back. It came back. His sight returned, and here is the quiet irony that I think about often. A man who was briefly, terribly blinded, who lay in real darkness, fearing it would be forever, rose up out of that darkness and spent the rest of his life teaching other people how to see. Not the world outside, the world inside. The one place we are all, every one of us, a little bit blind. So, what did he want us to see? He begins with a single idea, and he gives it a name. Amour propre. Self-love. And in his very first true maxim, he defines the theme of everything that follows, in words so simple a child could hold them. Self-love, he writes, is the greatest of all flatterers. Think of the most skilled flatterer you have ever known. Not the obvious one, the person who lays it on thick and you can see through them immediately. Think of the subtler one, the one who says the right thing at exactly the right moment, who somehow always knows what you most need to hear, who leaves you feeling, every time, a little better about yourself than you did before. That person, La Rochefoucauld says, is you. You are the one doing it. You are the great flatterer, and the person you flatter most skillfully, most tenderly, most reliably, is yourself. This is where the scalpel enters. Because if that is true, if self-love is genuinely the greatest flatterer any of us will ever encounter, then it follows, with a kind of quiet logic, that we cannot trust our own account of our own goodness. Not entirely, not automatically. The very faculty we would use to examine our motives is the same faculty that has an interest in finding those motives pure. The detective is also the suspect, and this is not a comfortable thing to sit with, not in the dark, not in the quiet before sleep, when the day's actions are still close enough to feel. But La Rochefoucauld is not asking you to sit with discomfort for its own sake. He is a surgeon, and a good surgeon does not cut you open for the pleasure of it. He cuts so that something can be seen, named, and then, with luck, healed, or at least understood. Let us follow his scalpel, then, slowly, one incision at a time. There is no hurry. The night is long, and the teaching is patient. He places a maxim before us that I want to stay with for a while, because it contains something most of us have felt without ever quite finding the words. He writes, and I am giving you the faithful English, "We would often be ashamed of our finest actions if the world understood all the motives behind them." Let us sit with that. We would often be ashamed, not of our worst actions, of our finest ones, the ones we are, in ordinary life, a little proud of, the donation made, the favour done, the comforting words spoken at the right moment, the hand extended to someone who was struggling. These are the ones he is looking at. And his claim is not that these actions are fake, or that they did no good, or that the person who received them was not genuinely helped. His claim is narrower and stranger than that. His claim is that if the full interior weather behind the action were visible, all of it, not the part we present to ourselves, but the whole of it, we would feel some colour in our face that was not pride. Let us explore a story about this. There is a woman, let us say, who works in a small town and who has a neighbour she has never particularly liked. The neighbour is difficult, complains often, returns coldness. Over the years there have been small frictions, the kind that settle into a low, permanent discomfort between two people who live close to each other. And then one winter the neighbour falls ill. Nothing life-threatening, but enough. She is alone, she cannot easily go out, she is in real difficulty for a few weeks. And our woman brings her food. She does this repeatedly through several cold weeks. She does not make a fuss about it. She simply brings food, leaves it, says very little. The neighbour recovers. She is grateful in her way, which is not a warm way, but it is genuine. And our woman, walking home after the last delivery, feels what? She feels good. She feels genuinely good. And she should. She did a genuinely good thing. But let us go a little deeper into that feeling of goodness, with the Duke's scalpel in hand. Is there, inside that feeling of goodness, something else as well? Something quieter, something she might not name easily? Is there a warmth that comes partly from having been, in this small drama, the better person? Not better in a cruel sense, simply better, more generous, more capable of rising above an old friction? Is there something in the feeling of goodness that is also the feeling of having won something, not over the neighbour exactly, but over the smaller version of herself that would have let the neighbour struggle? Is there, woven into the genuine kindness, a thread of something that has to do with how she sees herself, and perhaps how she imagines others might see her when she walks down that street again? She would not put it this way. She would not need to put it this way. The action was real, the soup was warm, the neighbour was helped. And all of that is true. But La Rochefoucauld would gently, without cruelty, ask her to notice the whole interior picture. Not to condemn it, not to take away anything that was real, but to see it. We would often be ashamed of our finest actions if the world understood all the motives behind them. This is what it means. Not that the action was worthless, but that the motive is rarely as simple as it looks, even, especially, when we are looking at ourselves. And so we come to another maxim, one that might be the most personally recognizable thing he ever wrote, the one that, when it lands, you feel a slight involuntary recognition somewhere behind the ribs. We only confess our small faults to persuade others that we have no great ones. Read that slowly. And notice, as you do, whether it reminds you of anything. We only confess our small faults to persuade others that we have no great ones. Not to be honest, not from a desire to be truly known, but as a kind of pre-emptive defense, as image management wearing the costume of vulnerability. The small fault confessed is a sacrifice, and like most sacrifices, it is intended to protect something. Think of how this works in an ordinary conversation. Someone mentions a mistake they made, and it is a real mistake, it is genuinely embarrassing, they are genuinely willing to name it. And the people around them think, what an honest person, what a self-aware person. How unusual, how admirable to be able to look at oneself so clearly. They rise in our estimation precisely because of the fault they named. And the fault they named, this is the part that takes a moment to absorb, may have been chosen, at least in part, because it is the kind of fault that looks like self-awareness, because it is bearable, because it will cost them something small and purchase them something larger. Let us explore a story about this. There is a man at a dinner party, a gathering of people he admires and wants to impress, and he is talking about a project he undertook some years ago. He describes it honestly enough. He mentions the ways it went wrong. He is quite detailed about the mistakes he made. He laughs at himself. He is charming about it. And everyone at the table is drawn toward him, because this is rare, a person who can admit failure so openly, so gracefully. He goes home that night feeling good about the evening. Now, what he did not mention at the dinner party was the thing he cannot tell anyone, the thing that actually still keeps him up, the small deception early in that project that he has never fully accounted for, the moment where he chose his own advantage over someone else's and called it something more dignified than it was. That part did not come out. What came out was the acceptable failure, the charming stumble, the self-criticism that is actually, quietly, a form of praise. Look how honestly I examine myself. He may not have planned it this way. That is the subtlety of amour propre. It works below the level of intention. He did not sit down and calculate, I will confess this fault to hide that one. It moved more naturally than that, more smoothly. Self-love knows which faults are safe to offer up and which ones to keep in the dark. And it makes those choices in a heartbeat before the words are even forming. This is you, perhaps, on some night you might remember, confessing something true, something real, something that did cost you something, and leaving something else in the pocket. La Rochefoucauld is not saying you are a liar. He is saying that self-love is a strategist, and it operates in all of us with a competence we rarely give it credit for. Let us rest here for just a moment. Take a slow, quiet breath. Let the chest soften. There is nothing to solve tonight, nothing to defend. These are not accusations. They are observations, offered calmly from across 4 centuries, by a man who found them true in himself first. When you are ready, we will continue. Now he turns to something smaller, lighter, but just as precise. He writes, "The refusal of praise is a wish to be praised twice. This one you may feel in the body before the mind catches up. Someone says something kind about you. They compliment your work, or your patience, or something you made, or said, or did. And you wave it off. You say, 'Oh, it was nothing.' You say, 'I'm sure anyone would have done the same.' You say, 'It could have been much better,' honestly, and as you say it, you are aware, faintly, in the way you are aware of a sound in the next room, that something in you is waiting for them to disagree, waiting for them to press the compliment closer, to confirm it, to say no, really, it was extraordinary. And when they do, there is a satisfaction that is a little different from simple pleasure. It is more than pleasure. It is vindication. Because they said it once, you declined, and they said it again. 2 commendations for the price of 1 dismissal. He is not being unkind here. He is pointing at something almost everyone has done, including, without question, himself. That is what keeps this from being cruelty. It reads as confession. He knows these movements because they are his. Let us explore a story about this. There is a scholar, a careful and serious woman, who has just given a talk she worked on for many months. The talk went well. At the end, a colleague approaches her and tells her it was one of the best things she has heard on this subject in years. The scholar says, with what feels like genuine warmth, "Oh, I think I rushed the second half. There were things I left out. I never quite know if these ideas are as solid as they should be." And the colleague, who meant what she said, says again, more firmly, "No, it was really wonderful." And the scholar feels, in that second moment, something she did not quite feel after the first. She feels confirmed. The second saying of it, earned by the first refusal, settles into her in a way the first alone would not have. She is not a vain woman. She works hard. She is genuinely uncertain about her work. That uncertainty is real. But inside that genuine uncertainty there is also, quietly, this waiting. This turning down so as to be turned back up. Amour propre does not require a vain person to operate. It operates in all of us, in the most modest, in the most earnest. That is its genius. The refusal of praise is a wish to be praised twice. He wrote it in 1 line. He did not need 2. And then, as if to follow the thread deeper, he pulls out a maxim that I find quietly extraordinary, not because it is his sharpest line, but because it is his most honest one about the engine itself. Virtue, he writes, would not go so far if vanity did not keep it company. Pause on that word, so far. Not that virtue does not exist without vanity, but that it does not go as far, that it does not travel as long a road, that the extra mile, the hard act, the sustained generosity often draws power from something other than pure principle. Vanity is the fuel that pushes good behaviour past the point where principle alone would have flagged and sat down. This is, in its way, a more complicated claim than the others, because it is almost an acknowledgement that the engine is necessary. Vanity keeps virtue company. Without it, virtue might still exist, but it would be smaller, shorter-winded, quicker to stop. The uncomfortable implication is that if we were to somehow remove all self-love from our good actions, we might find ourselves doing less good in the world, not more. Let us explore a story about this. There is a man who donates to a cause he believes in. He has done this for years, quietly, modestly, without telling many people. And when he examines his reasons, he finds layers. There is the layer that is simply, this cause matters, these people need help. This is what I should do with some of what I have. That layer is real. But there is another layer, deeper down, which has to do with the kind of person he wants to be. The kind of man he sees when he thinks about himself at his best. Someone who gives. Someone who does not spend everything on himself. Someone, perhaps, who his children might one day think well of, or who his own conscience can face without flinching. And there is another layer still, which has to do with how it feels on the morning after a donation, when the mind moves quietly over the previous day and finds that one deed, and rests there for a moment with something like satisfaction. Now, if we remove the second and third layers, the identity, the quiet inner warmth, the approval he extends to himself, would he still give? Perhaps not as much. Perhaps not as consistently. Perhaps the months when giving feels less meaningful, less connected to that inner warmth, are the months when he gives a little less, and he does not quite notice the connection. Virtue would not go so far if vanity did not keep it company. And here is the thing La Rochefoucauld does not say, but allows us to understand. This is not a condemnation. It is a description. If vanity is doing some of the work of sustaining goodness in the world, then vanity is, in this specific way, useful. The engine is not evil. It is simply not what we told ourselves it was. And that difference between what we told ourselves and what is actually driving us is what he is asking us to see. He is very patient about the engine. He returns to it from a different angle a few lines later, and this angle is perhaps the one that catches the most light. He writes, self-interest speaks all sorts of tongues and plays all sorts of parts, even that of disinterestedness. Even that of disinterestedness. There is something almost admiring in that sentence, as if he cannot help but be impressed by the range of self-love. It is a gifted performer. It can speak in the voice of generosity, it can speak in the voice of justice, it can speak in the voice of sacrifice and sorrow and pure devotion. And its most astonishing performance, the one that deserves the longest applause, is the performance of having no interest at all, of being purely, entirely, transparently for you and for nothing else. Let us explore a story about this. There is a woman in a family who is known for her selflessness. This is genuinely how she is described by everyone who knows her. She is the one who stays late, the one who gives things up, the one who says, "Please, take the larger room, I am perfectly comfortable with the smaller one." The one who says, "No, don't worry about me." The family relies on her in ways they could not easily articulate, and they are grateful in the way that families are grateful, which is to say, incompletely, because it is hard to be fully grateful for something that has always been there. Now, if you were to sit with this woman, quietly, in a room without performance, and ask her very gently what it gives her, the selflessness, the staying late, the taking the smaller room, she would tell you first that it gives her nothing, that she does it because it needs to be done, because she loves them. And that is true. But if you were patient, and the room were quiet enough, something else might surface. Something about how it feels, at the center of things, how the family would be lost without her, and she knows it. How there is a warmth in being needed that is not the same as being loved, but is in some ways more reliable. How the staying late and the taking the smaller room have built, over years, a kind of identity that she is more attached to than she knows, that she is, in part, the selfless one, not only in her family's eyes but in her own. And that selfless one is a self, a very specific, very carefully maintained self, and self-love tends, with great delicacy, its own garden. None of this makes her love false. None of it makes the sacrifice unreal. But self-interest speaks all sorts of tongues, including the tongue of disinterestedness, including that one especially. And now there is a maxim so short, so quiet, that it almost sounds like kindness at first. Then you feel it. We all have strength enough to bear the misfortunes of others. Read it again, slowly. We all have strength enough to bear the misfortunes of others. There is a breath of compassion in there at first glance, a recognition of human resilience. But the tone shifts when you understand what he is really saying. He is saying that the suffering of someone else is, for most of us, most of the time, a thing we can bear quite easily, because it is theirs, because there is, between their pain and ours, a comfortable, invisible distance. We can look at it, feel something that resembles sorrow, say the right things, and still eat dinner well that night. The misfortune of others is a spectacle we attend, and then leave. He is not being a cynic here. He is pointing at something that everyone who has ever sat with another person's grief, really sat with it past the first hour, knows to be true. There is a difference between the sympathy we offer and the sympathy we feel. There is a difference between what our face does and what the core of us does. Bearing the misfortunes of others is something we can do, and often do genuinely, without it costing us very much. Because we have the one thing that makes it bearable, it is not ours. Let us explore a story about this. There is a man who hears that an old friend has lost his job, a job the friend cared about, that was tied up with how he understood himself and what his days were for. And this man feels, genuinely, sorry. He reaches out. He says the right things. He means them, in the moment. He thinks about his friend that day and into the evening, and there is something in the thinking that is real concern. And then, a few weeks later, he realizes he has not thought about the friend very much at all. Not because he stopped caring, exactly, but because the friend's difficulty had not interrupted his own life in any significant way. The misfortune was real. His feeling was real. But it was carried in a part of himself that did not weigh very heavily on the rest. And then imagine that the man loses his own job, a week later, without warning, and he understands, in his body, in a way that has nothing to do with sympathy, what his friend was carrying. And it is nothing like what he thought. It is not the shape he imagined. It is heavier and stranger, and it sits in places he did not know a thing could sit. We all have strength enough to bear the misfortunes of others, because we bear them from a safe distance, because the load, however heavy it looks, is not on our back. He is not blaming us for this. He is saying, see it, see the distance, see what your compassion actually costs you. And then, knowing what it costs, be a little more patient with yourself about the limits of your feeling, and a little more honest about what it would mean to truly bear someone else's weight. Now let us rest here, just briefly. Take a breath. Let the body settle deeper. Notice the quiet. Let these thoughts drift without holding them. You do not need to solve anything tonight. When you are ready, we will continue. And we arrive, with that breath behind us, at a maxim that is perhaps the most famous line La Rochefoucauld ever wrote, the one most often quoted, most often stripped of its context and held up as a pure, cold verdict on human nature. And I want to give it back its full, strange complexity, because on its own it sounds like a closing of a door. In its full shape, it is something quite different. Hypocrisy, he writes, is a tribute that vice pays to virtue. Hypocrisy is a tribute that vice pays to virtue. The internet loves this line for the first half. For the exposure of hypocrisy, for the confirmation that people who pretend to be good are secretly not good and that we were right to suspect them. But the whole sentence does something stranger. Because a tribute is not nothing. A tribute is an acknowledgement. A tribute is offered to something that commands respect. If vice must dress itself in virtue's clothes to walk in the world, if it cannot show up in public in its own face, if it must wear the borrowed coat of decency and kindness and principle, then what does that tell us about virtue? It tells us that virtue is the standard, that even the people who do not reach it or who have stopped trying still understand it well enough to imitate it, still find it necessary to perform it, still believe at some level that the world they live in will not accept them without some surface of goodness. He is a cynic and a kind of idealist in the same sentence. That is the trick. He is saying, yes, hypocrisy is everywhere. And yes, even hypocrisy proves that virtue is the measure everyone secretly accepts. The faker still knows what the real thing looks like. The tribute is genuine even when the payer is not. Let us explore a story about this. There is a council. Let us imagine a small governing body of some kind, a committee, the kind of small pocket of power that exists in every institution. And there is a man on this council who is known for his speeches about fairness. He gives them often and well. He speaks about equal treatment, about the importance of listening to all voices, about the values that should guide their decisions. He is eloquent. Some of the younger people on the council have been genuinely moved by his words. They believe in him, the way young people believe in the version of a person that a good speech makes available. And then, one day, a decision comes before the council that touches his own interests. Not obviously, it never is obvious, but unmistakably, to anyone looking with clear eyes. And he votes with great apparent principle in the direction that benefits him. He has a reason ready. He always has a reason ready. And the reason sounds exactly like his speeches. It uses the same vocabulary, the same cadences, the same appeal to the values he has so consistently named. The younger people on the council are confused. One or two of them feel the confusion that comes just before a small disillusionment. They cannot quite place what is wrong. What is wrong, La Rochefoucauld would say, is not surprising. Vice has paid a tribute to virtue. The man used the language of fairness not because he had abandoned it, but because he still understood its power. Because he knew, at some unexamined level, that you cannot simply vote your interest and name it as such, you must dress it. Virtue is the dress. The tribute is real, in its strange way. He cannot ignore virtue, he can only wear it falsely, and this is the knife turn in the maxim. It is cynical, yes, the hypocrisy is exposed, but it is also oddly affirming. If everyone must pay tribute to virtue to move in the world, then virtue is not a fiction, it is a standard that holds. Even the people who violate it most efficiently do so in its name. Even vice knows what the good looks like. There is something in this, if you hold it patiently, that is not despair. It is something more complicated. Something like, the ideal survives, even in the mouths of those who do not live up to it. Perhaps because of them, because they cannot simply walk away from it, they must keep carrying it forward, even falsely. And in carrying it forward, they keep it in the air. They keep it as the thing everyone is measured against, including themselves. He adds, in a maxim that belongs in the same breath, that self-interest speaks all sorts of tongues, plays all sorts of parts. The part of justice, the part of disinterest, the part of principle. And now we see these two maxims together, they become a single, quietly devastating picture. We are all, in our different ways, performers of a virtue we only partially possess. And the virtue we perform is real, the standard is real, even when the performer is not equal to it. This is the mechanism he is describing, worked out from half a dozen different angles. A good act can be driven by the desire to feel superior. The confession of a fault is often a way of protecting a greater fault from view. The refusal of praise is itself a hunt for praise. The sustained virtue runs partly on vanity. The face of pure disinterest can be self-interest in its finest costume. The compassion we offer is cushioned by the distance we keep. And the hypocrite's tribute to virtue, however hollow, confirms that the standard is still standing. None of this is flattering. And I want to acknowledge that before we go any further tonight, none of this is comfortable to sit with. If you have been listening with some part of yourself that is honest, there may be a small, familiar discomfort somewhere. The feeling of being seen somewhere you thought you were hidden. The feeling of recognizing yourself in a description that was not meant kindly. That feeling is, I think, the point. That is where the scalpel has done its work. Not to wound you and leave you there, but to let you see something that was previously dark. And La Rochefoucauld is patient about the discomfort, because he felt it himself. He is not writing from the outside, he is writing from inside the same condition he is describing. That is why the maxims read as they do, not as an accusation, but as something colder and more honest than accusation. As a mirror held up by a hand that is not entirely steady either. We are so used to disguising ourselves from others, he will write. And we will come to that maxim in full, that in the end we disguise ourselves from ourselves. The deepest deception is not the one we practice on other people, it is the one we practice on our own understanding of why we do what we do. And here, in the small hours, is where that lands most quietly and most clearly. Not as a verdict, as an invitation to look. What he is offering, what this book, in all its cool precision, is actually offering, is not the counsel of despair. It is the beginning of something else. Something that begins with discomfort and moves slowly toward a particular kind of freedom. But that is where the night takes us next. For now, let the mechanism settle. Let these maxims rest in the dark without asking them to resolve into anything. The man who confesses small faults, the woman who waves off praise and waits, the man who bears his friend's misfortune from a comfortable distance, the counsellor who speaks in virtue's voice. These are not monsters. They are people. They are people, and they are, in their different ways, you and I. And seeing that clearly, seeing it without flattery and without punishment, is already something the Duke thought mattered. He will tell us why, a little further into the night. But to understand why, you have to understand where he came from. Because the maxims did not arrive in the world the way most books do. They were not the product of a scholar in a quiet library, reasoning his way toward an abstract conclusion about human nature. They were not the work of a man who had kept a comfortable distance from the machinery of ambition and power and then sat down to describe what he imagined it looked like. They were something harder to make and rarer to read. They were the distillation of a life actually lived inside the thing they describe, a life that had been broken open by it. François de La Rochefoucauld was born in 1613 into one of the oldest noble families in France. The name itself was ancient. The title, Duke, was old enough to carry the weight of generations before him. He grew up knowing that his position in the world was fixed and magnificent, and that it came with a particular kind of certainty about oneself. The kind of certainty that does not arrive from having tested anything. It simply is. You are a duke. You act accordingly. Your instincts are the right ones. Your causes are the worthy ones. Your feelings, when they rise, are the feelings of a man whose feelings have always mattered. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man whose amour propre would be most spectacular in its self-confidence and most devastating in its defeat. The defeat came from the Fronde. The Fronde. Let us say that word slowly, in the dark. It means a sling, like a boy's sling for throwing stones. It was the name given to a series of rebellions that shook France between 1648 and 1653. During the years when Louis XIV was still a child and power rested with his mother, the Queen Regent Anne of Austria, and with her chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. The rebellions were a tangle of grievances, tax disputes, constitutional arguments, wounded aristocratic pride, factions within factions, alliances made and broken and made again in different arrangements. At their height, Paris itself was a battleground. Great nobles raised armies. The court fled. There were barricades in the streets. La Rochefoucauld was at the centre of it. Not as a spectator, not as a cautious participant hedging his position. He committed himself completely. He conspired, he fought, he risked his fortune and his standing and his body on the outcome. And he did not do it for France, though he would have said he did. He did not do it for any principle, exactly, though he would have given you principles by the handful. He did it for the reasons that people at the centre of power always do things, a knot of ambition and loyalty and love and wounded vanity so tightly wound that even he, even afterward, would have had difficulty separating one strand from another. Among those strands was a woman. Anne Geneviève de Bourbon was the Duchesse de Longueville, the sister of the great General Conde, one of the most brilliant and commanding women in France. She was at the centre of the aristocratic faction in the Fronde. La Rochefoucauld's connection to her, his commitment to her cause, his willingness to follow her political lead, to fight under her banner, shaped years of his life. She was the kind of person around whom self-love puts on its most splendid costume. To serve her was to be, he could tell himself, loyal, brave, principled, devoted to something larger than himself. Whether any of that was true, in the way he told it to himself, is exactly the question his later book would turn on like a blade. The Fronde failed. Or rather, it dissolved, not in a single clean defeat, but in the slow, humiliating way that factional rebellions dissolve, with allies drifting away, positions becoming untenable, each great figure retreating at a slightly different angle. Conde ended up on the wrong side of the border in service to Spain. The Duchesse de Longueville retreated from the world entirely, eventually entering a convent at Maubuisson, where she spent the rest of her life. The aristocratic cause, the one he had wagered so much on, vanished without having achieved the thing it claimed to be fighting for. What it had achieved was to reveal itself, And La Rochefoucauld had seen that revelation from the inside, close enough to have no comfortable distance from it. He had watched men swear loyalty and then renegotiate. He had seen principles held up in the morning and laid down quietly at supper. He had seen his own heart, brave and devoted one moment, calculating in the next, moving between genuine feeling and tactical position in a way that he himself could not always map with certainty. He had been given, by the Fronde, an education in the exact mechanism the maxims would later describe, not from reading about it, from living it. And then the wound. In 1652, at the Battle of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, fighting in the streets of Paris itself, at the barricades of the city he had helped bring to rebellion, La Rochefoucauld was shot through the face. A musket ball crossing both eyes. He went down in the street, he was lifted up and carried, and for a time, for weeks, he did not know whether he would ever see again. Let that settle for a moment. A man who had spent years believing in his own clarity of vision, in the rightness of his cause, in the coherence of his own motives, was struck blind. Briefly, agonizingly blind. He lay in darkness and waited. He recovered his sight. Not perfectly, not at once, but he recovered it. He would have eye trouble for the rest of his life. But he could see again. And what he did with the remaining decades of that life was to build, with great precision and even greater patience, a machine for seeing what most of us spend our lives declining to see. He had been shown, in the most visceral way available, what it is to be deprived of the thing you take for granted. He understood, in his body, what blindness meant. And when he turned his long convalescing attention inward toward the thing the battlefield had taught him, what he found there was a different kind of blindness entirely, the one we carry inside us, the one that has never been shot away from us, the one we choose. That choice, to stop choosing blindness, to look at the hidden engine, is the book. He emerged from the Fronde diminished in almost every external way. Financially strained, politically sidelined. The great cause collapsed, the connection to the Duchesse de Longueville over, and she herself vanished into prayer and penance. He was in his late 30s, scarred, unsteady in his vision, his social position smaller than his name suggested it should be. The Duke had been defeated, quietly, at every level. And so he went to Paris, and to a drawing room. The salon of the Marquise de Sablé is not, at first, the place you would expect the sharpest moral anatomy of the century to be born. Madeleine de Souvré, the Marquise de Sablé, was a remarkable woman, a hostess of extraordinary refinement, a political mind of real acuity, and herself touched, as we will come to in a moment, by the severe and serious theological current called Jansenism. Her salon, in the Place Royale and later near the Abbey of Port Royal itself, was one of the great gathering points of Parisian intellectual life in the 1650s and 1660s. Writers and aristocrats and clergy and wits came there to think aloud, to argue, to compete. And one of the things they competed in was the maxim. The polished single sentence of moral observation, hard, compressed, precise, designed to be devastating, was a game at Madame de Sablé's table. Guests would compose them. They would exchange them. They would sharpen each other's, argue over phrasings, push toward a kind of crystalline cruelty that was also, somehow, a kind of art. The social game of the salon was the kiln in which these lines were fired. Think of what that means for the maxims. The polished savagery you feel in those lines, the sense that someone has found the briefest possible way to say the worst possible thing about human nature and made it beautiful in the process. That quality was not accidental. It was the residue of a game played by people who were competing over many evenings to outthink and outphrase each other. Wit sharpened against wit. The flatness of the line, the click of its closure, the way it seems to leave no room for argument, these are not just La Rochefoucauld's gifts. They are what happened when his observations were submitted to the heat of that particular room, refined in the fire of brilliant, critical, competing intelligence. He was not alone in the project. He never pretended to be entirely alone. Among the people closest to the book's development was a man named Jacques Esprit, a moralist, a man of letters, a contemporary who moved in the same circles and shared the same dark view of human motivation. Esprit eventually published a full-length treatise, La Faussaire des Vertus Humaines, which translates as something like the falseness of human virtues. The argument was the same one that runs through the maxims, that what we call virtue, examined closely, turns out to be driven by self-love, by interest, by forces that have nothing to do with the noble motives we assign ourselves. Esprit said it at length, in long, careful chapters, building the case step by step, marshalling arguments, taking the reader through the evidence. La Rochefoucauld said the same thing in a sentence. That is, in a way, the aesthetic achievement of the book. What Esprit needed a treatise to say, La Rochefoucauld said in a blade of prose that could be read in 2 seconds and thought about for a lifetime. But their proximity, their friendship, their shared circle, the overlap of their arguments, tells you something important. This was not a solitary, eccentric conclusion. This was a shared understanding, moving through a particular Parisian world, at a particular moment in French intellectual life, being sharpened in drawing rooms and hallways and correspondence. And behind both of them, behind the entire project, was something older and more serious than a drawing room game. It was a theology. The hidden engine underneath the maxims is not cynicism. It is not worldly disillusionment exactly, though that provided the personal fuel. The hidden engine is Jansenism, and understanding that changes what the book is. Jansenism was a rigorously Augustinian current of Catholic thought, centred in France in the 17th century, most powerfully associated with the Abbey of Port-Royal on the outskirts of Paris. Its theological spine was the doctrine that after Adam's fall, human nature is corrupted to its root. Without divine grace, not just assisted, but genuinely saved by grace, human beings act from self-love. Their apparent virtues are not real virtues, because the corruption runs beneath them to the motive itself. A man may give to the poor, but if grace has not transformed his heart, his giving springs from pride, from the desire to feel generous, from the flattery he receives in return. The act looks good, the root is crooked. This was not a fringe position. Blaise Pascal, one of the greatest minds of the century, mathematician, physicist, philosopher, writer of the Penses, that extraordinary notebook of faith and doubt that has not stopped mattering in 350 years, was deeply embedded in the Port-Royal world. His sister Jacqueline took vows there. He wrote the Lettres Provinciales in its defence. And the Penses themselves are full of the Jansenist conviction that we cannot see ourselves truly, that our self-love is vast and subtle, that without something outside ourselves we are imprisoned in flattering fictions about our own worth and goodness. Pierre Nicole, one of the great Jansenist theologians of the Abbey, wrote essays on the moral life, on charity, on self-love, on the way social virtue functions as a kind of organized self-interest that circle the same territory as the maxims from within the theological walls. What La Rochefoucauld did, and this is the thing most people who quote him miss entirely, is take the Jansenist theology and remove its theological frame. He kept the psychology. He kept the anatomy of amour propre, the relentless, shape-shifting self-love that infiltrates every motive. He kept the radical skepticism about apparent virtue. But he cleared away the doctrine, the grace, the salvation, the doctrinal architecture, and left only the observation. He took what was a rigorous theological claim about fallen human nature and translated it into a secular, social, drawing-room form. He made it available to people who had no particular theological commitments, who would never read Port Royal's theological treatises, but who might pick up a slim, beautiful book of maxims and feel the blade of the thing all the same. His psychology is dressed-down theology. That is the unexpected connection. The coldness you feel in the maxims, the severity, the sense that there is no easy escape from the verdict, that is not the coldness of worldly cynicism. It is the coldness of a very specific theological view of human nature that had been stripping the ornaments from apparent virtue for decades before La Rochefoucauld put it in prose small enough to hold in one hand. When the Marquise de Sablé is described as touched by Jansenism, that is not a biographical footnote. It is the connecting thread. The salon where the maxims were sharpened was itself in conversation with Port Royal's ideas. The two things, the drawing-room game and the theological rigour, were not separate. They were the same current flowing through different rooms. And then, in 1664, the book escaped before he was ready. An unauthorized edition appeared in Holland, printed in the Netherlands from a manuscript that had been circulating among the salon's correspondents, passed from hand to hand in that way manuscripts did in the years before something became a book. La Rochefoucauld had not authorized this. He had not finished it, had not settled the final form of its sentences, had not made all the decisions a careful author makes about what to include and what to remove. The pirated text was out. It was being read. He published his own authorized first edition the following year, in 1665, partly in response, to correct the text, to take back control of his own sentences, to present the work as he actually meant it to appear. The book he had been making in private, in the salon, in the slow refinement of years, was now a public thing, whether he was ready or not. It was received with anxiety as well as admiration. Polite society found it scandalous, not simply provocative, but genuinely uncomfortable in the way that well-aimed mirrors are uncomfortable. People who had spent their lives performing virtue in the approved ways, who had built their social identities on being seen as generous, loyal, principled, found themselves reading a book that suggested all of that might be a very elegant arrangement of self-interest. The discomfort was real, and it was, in a way, the proof that the thing was working. He went on refining the book through 4 more authorized editions over the following 13 years, 1666, 1671, 1675, and the final 5th edition of 1678, the one that contains 504 maxims and stands as the definitive text. He was sharpening, always sharpening, cutting what didn't hold, keeping what was irreducibly true. And in that long process of cutting, he made one decision that is, when you know about it, almost unbearably revealing. He deleted the longest, most complete, most anatomically detailed description of amour propre he ever wrote. It appeared in the first edition, in 1665. It was not a maxim, exactly, not a single-blade sharp sentence. It was something more sprawling, a portrait, a prose study of self-love, as if self-love were a living creature, a creature of extraordinary cunning, a creature that could put on any face, infiltrate any feeling, disguise itself even from the person it inhabited. He wrote it as though describing an animal he had studied for years, one that had the unnerving talent of becoming invisible precisely when you looked at it most directly. The greatest deceptions of others, he wrote in this portrait, are exceeded by the deceptions we practice on ourselves. He included it in 1665. It was the most complete statement of everything the book was about. It was his boldest incision. And then he removed it. In every subsequent edition, it was gone. It survives in what scholars call the maxims suprimes, the suppressed maxims, catalogued there as Maxim 563. But La Rochefoucauld himself chose not to include it. He, who had spent years revealing what everyone else preferred not to see, cut from his own book the page that saw most clearly. Why? It is, characteristically, not something he explained. The decision is there, in the additions, in the removal. No commentary. But here is what the removal suggests, if you sit with it quietly. The suppressed portrait was not too cruel toward others. Everything in the authorized maxims is at least as pitiless, sentence by sentence. What the portrait may have been was too complete, too finished, too much like a verdict. The shorter maxims leave gaps, space for the most often, space for the reader to place themselves inside the observation without feeling sentenced by it. The long portrait closed around the subject the way a net closes. It left nowhere to move. And La Rochefoucauld, in the end, did not want to write a net. He wanted to write a mirror. The difference is everything. A net traps. A mirror lets you see, and then you decide what to do with what you see. He cut his own sharpest incision, because the sharpest incision was not the most useful one. That is either the act of a man who had learnt something about the difference between diagnosis and verdict, or it is the act of a man whose own amour propre preferred to be known as a surgeon rather than a prosecutor. Perhaps it is both. He would have been the first to say both is possible. Let us stay with the maxims that remained. Because the ones that stayed, the ones he chose to keep through 5 editions and 13 years of revision, these are the ones worth settling into. There is one that sits near the centre of everything and is almost never the first one quoted. It runs like this: we are so used to disguising ourselves from others that in the end we disguise ourselves from ourselves. That is Maxim 119, approximately, and it changes the angle of the whole book. Because the maxims that come before it, the ones about confessing small faults to seem humble, about modesty waiting for more applause, about virtue needing vanity as a companion, those can still be read as observations about other people, about the man over there, the woman across the room, the politician you saw on the news. You can read those and feel the mild, pleasurable superiority of having understood something your neighbour hasn't. You are not really implicated. You are the reader, standing outside, nodding. Maxim 119 does not let you stand outside. It says, you have been doing this so long, to so many people, in so many forms, that the habit has turned inward. The costume is not just what you wear for others now, it is what you wear for yourself, in the dark, when no one is watching. The self you have constructed for the audience has become, through long practice, the only self you can clearly see. The inner audience is as deceived as the outer one. This is not cruelty, it is compassion of the most surgical kind. Because the only way forward from a deception this deep and this habitual is to see it. and you cannot begin to see it until someone has named it precisely enough that you recognize your own face in the description. Consider what follows in the same neighborhood of the book. Everyone complains of his memory, he writes, and no one complains of his judgment. That is Maxim 89 approximately, and it is smaller and funnier than Maxim 119, but it lands in the same place. We are perfectly willing to admit the limitations of our memory, that is a mechanical failure, outside the self's control, not a reflection on us. Our memory let us down. But our judgment? Our judgment is who we are. Our judgment is the faculty by which we decide what is true and what matters and what to do. To complain of your judgment is to admit that the person who chose and decided and evaluated was flawed at the root, and almost no one is willing to do that. So we misremember. We don't misjudge. The misremembering is a technical error. The misjudgment would be a character indictment. And amour propre, which is always managing the story we tell ourselves, is very careful about which of those two it will allow us to own. He keeps going. The love of justice, he writes, is in most men only the fear of suffering injustice. Maxim 78, approximately. And here the scalpel is moving into territory that might at first feel almost politically sensitive, because justice is the word we use for everything noble in our social arrangements. Justice is what we rally around, what we demand, what we claim when we feel wronged. And he is saying, look more carefully at the timing of your love of justice. Notice when it flares. Notice who it tends to target. Notice that the people most loudly committed to justice are very often the people who have most recently experienced or most credibly fear a particular form of injustice against themselves. He is not saying that justice is a fiction. He is saying that the feeling we experience as love of justice is often, when examined, something closer to a very well-dressed version of the desire not to be on the wrong end of power. This is not comfortable. But it is, if you let it settle, a useful thing to know about yourself in the moments when you feel that particular righteous heat. To ask, quietly, alongside the genuine moral feeling, is any of this also about me? About my position? About a fear wearing the robes of a principle? He is not asking you to stop caring about justice. He is asking you to know yourself well enough to carry both things at once. And then, gratitude. In most of mankind, gratitude is only a secret desire to receive greater benefits. That is close to Maxim 298, and there is a companion line. We seldom find people ungrateful as long as we can still do them favors, which edges toward Maxim 306. These two maxims together describe something that once seen becomes impossible to unsee. We celebrate gratitude as one of the more selfless feelings, the feeling that turns outward toward someone else in acknowledgement of what they have given. And La Rochefoucauld says yes. And look at the full shape of it. Gratitude that runs deep, that persists, that is freely offered even when no further benefit is expected, that is rare and genuinely valuable. But most of what we call gratitude is warmer, more hopeful, more investment-oriented than that. It maintains the relationship. It keeps the channel open. It signals to the benefactor that more giving would be welcome and would continue to be appreciated. We are grateful, in other words, partly in order to go on being given to. And repentance. He reaches the same conclusion in a different room of the heart. Our repentance, he writes, is not so much regret for the harm we have done as fear of the harm that may come to us. Maxim 180, approximately, the feeling we name as moral, as remorse, as conscience operating as it should, as the self-correcting mechanism of a good person, is often, examined honestly, something closer to anxiety management. I am not sorry so much as afraid of consequences. The guilt is real. But underneath the guilt is a calculation about risk, a management of what might happen next if I do not present myself as sufficiently repentant. Conscience as a form of self-protection so deep and so habitual that it genuinely feels like remorse, because by the time the self-love has finished disguising it, the costume fits perfectly. This is where the book can begin to feel vertiginous. Each observation opens onto another. If even my gratitude is partly an investment, and my repentance is partly risk management, and my love of justice is partly self-protection, where does the self end and the machinery begin? Is there a place in here that is actually me, actually mine, actually free of the relentless lobbying of amour propre? That is the question the next part of the night is going to take apart, gently and carefully. The answer is not what the cynics who love these maxims think it is. The answer is not that you are hollow, not that goodness is a lie, not that everything dissolves into mechanism. It is something older and quieter than that. Something the Duke learned, not just from the salon and the theology and the Fronde, but from the particular education of his own long, wounded, clear-eyed life. But for now, for this moment in the dark, stay with what has been laid out. The man, the war, the woman, the wound, the drawing room where wit was sharpened into blades, the theology that gave those blades their particular shape, the pirated book that forced his hand, and the authorized one he spent 13 years perfecting. The portrait he wrote and then removed, the boldest incision that he judged, in the end, was too complete to be useful. And the maxims that remained. The quiet ones. The ones about memory and judgment, about justice and gratitude. About repentance as risk management and conscience as a very convincing costume. Each of them not a verdict, but an invitation. Each of them saying, look here. Look at this particular corner of your interior life, in this particular moment, and see if you recognize anything. He is not asking you to be ashamed. He never asks you to be ashamed. Shame is, as he knows perfectly well, just another form of amour propre, another way of making yourself the centre of attention, another costume the self puts on when it wants to perform the emotion of self-knowledge without actually having it. What he is asking is quieter than shame, and harder. He is asking you to see without the costume. Without the story, without the flattering narrative that amour propre provides, in every waking hour, about why you did what you did, about what your motives really were, about the quality of the person you are to yourself. He is asking you to look at yourself the way he learned to look, from inside a long, complicated, wounded life, after the battles and the blind days and the retreats. After the disillusionment and the losses, in the cool late evening of a Paris drawing room, in a city that had once burned with your ambitions and was now simply the place where you lived and tried to see clearly. In the candle-lit rooms near the Place Royale, among people who were also trying to see clearly in their various ways, he found the form his seeing would take. A sentence, precise, balanced, closed, leaving just enough room for the reader to step inside. He cut the page that went too far. He kept the ones that went far enough. That, too, is a kind of wisdom. To know the difference between the incision that illuminates and the incision that destroys. To understand that a mirror is only useful if the person looking into it is still willing to look. He wanted the reader willing to look. And so, in the long practice of the salons and the slow revision of editions, in the company of Madeleine de Souvré and Jacques Esprit, and the severe clear current of Jansenist theology moving through Port Royal, he made a book that is, in its deepest intention, an act of compassionate precision. Not a weapon against human goodness, a lens for examining it honestly. The difference between a weapon and a lens is the question of who the maker thinks is worth the effort of being seen clearly. La Rochefoucauld, for all his apparent coldness, thought you were worth it. He thought we were worth it. And in the long, quiet hours of this night, when the thinking is soft and the day has stopped pressing, that may be the most useful thing to carry. Not the sting of a particular maxim, not the slight vertigo of wondering whether your own kindness runs on a hidden engine, but this, a man who was shot through both eyes and lost his war and watched his world contract to a drawing room and a set of careful sentences decided, in that contraction, to spend what remained of his life trying to help other people see. Not to punish them with what they found, to help them look. The suppressed portrait of amour propre, the one he cut from his book, described self-love as something that exceeds even the deceptions we practice on others, as a creature more cunning about us than we can ever be about it. And then he removed it, because the creature, described that completely, had no more room to move, and without room to move, the reader could not move either. Could not turn toward it, examine it, let it illuminate something. He made space for you in the removing. He made space in the book for your own discovery. That, in the quiet of this hour, is not cynicism. That is almost a form of love. And so we arrive at the word. We have been circling it the whole time, without quite naming it. The maxims have done their work. The sting of recognizing yourself in one line, the mild vertigo of wondering whether your generosity has a hidden passenger, the strange relief of watching someone else describe what you have only half admitted to yourself. And now, at the end of all that cutting, there is one small French phrase that changes the nature of everything he did. Le plus souvent. Most often. It is the word in the epigraph. The sentence he placed at the very door of his book, the sentence that greets every reader before a single maxim. Nos vertus ne sont, le plus souvent, que des vices gis. Our virtues are, most often, only vices in disguise. Not always, not exclusively, not without exception. Most often. You could read the whole book and miss it. Most people do. The internet certainly does, the quote farms and the dark psychology reels, and the self-declared realists who share him like a weapon tend to drop those two words without ceremony and present the claim as absolute. He said we are all secretly selfish. He unmasked virtue as fraud. He proved goodness is a lie. He did not say that. He was too precise to say that. And precision, in a man who spent 13 years across 5 editions refining the same 400 and more sentences, was not an accident. It was the entire point. He changed words between editions, he removed maxims that went too far, he cut his own most sweeping portrait of amour propre because it was too complete, too closed, and a closed picture gives a reader nowhere to stand. Every revision moved him toward accuracy and away from spectacle, toward the difficult truth and away from the comfortable one, which in this case was the comfortable cynicism that lets you feel superior to the species. Le plus souvent is not a hedge, it is a door. Behind that door is the acknowledgement that something real is happening when a person acts generously, when a nurse stays late, when a stranger returns the lost wallet, when a mother forgives the thing that was not forgivable. Those acts exist. He saw them. He simply did not believe they were entirely what they appeared to be, and he did not believe the person performing them always knew what drove them. Most often the motive is mixed. Most often amour propre has quietly joined the enterprise and made itself useful. But most often is not always. And the door he left open is the door through which genuine goodness walks, when it does. He was a diagnostician. A diagnostician is not a prosecutor. The doctor who tells you your heart has a murmur is not saying you are dying. She is saying, this is what is here, this is what it does, this is what it means for how you live. La Rochefoucauld looked at human motive the way a doctor looks at a symptom, with curiosity rather than condemnation, and with the belief that seeing clearly, even when what you see is uncomfortable, is better than the alternative. The alternative was what he found everywhere around him, the comfortable story. The story in which your virtue was pure because you felt it was pure, in which your intentions were good because you meant well, in which the applause you received for a selfless act was entirely unrelated to the pleasure you took in receiving it. He had lived that story, in the Fronde, among people who used language about honour and nobility and loyalty as cover for ambition and score-settling and self-preservation. He had been one of those people. That is the confession underneath the book. He was not a man describing others. He was a man describing himself. And that changes everything about how to read him. There is a maxim, number 22 in the 1678 ordering, that gets less attention than the great cuts about hypocrisy and vanity, but it matters. Philosophy triumphs easily over evils past and evils to come, but present evils triumph over philosophy. He is describing the limits of detachment, the idea that you can reason your way to equanimity, that the wise man stands above the fray in untroubled clarity. He disbelieves it. Present pain wins. Present fear wins. The calm philosophical observer is a pose that collapses the moment the thing is actually happening to you. He is not exempt. The maxim turns inward. This is a man who has included himself in his own diagnosis, not in a self-flagellating way, not in the way of someone who performs self-criticism as its own variety of self-display. He has a maxim for that too, the one that says we would rather speak ill of ourselves than not talk about ourselves at all. He knew that move. He had seen it in salons and in his own mirror. Self-deprecation is one of amour propre's cleverest disguises. It keeps you at the centre of the story, which is exactly where amour propre wants you. The position he arrived at is different from self-criticism. It is closer to a kind of calm. The calm of a man who has stopped needing to convince himself of his own exceptional virtue and who found, in that stopping, something unexpectedly light. This is what the maxims are when you read them in order, slowly, as a sustained act of attention rather than a grab for quotable ammunition. They are a mirror. Not the flattering kind, not the cruel kind, the honest kind, which is the rarest kind, the kind that shows you your face as it actually is, with the morning light on it and the sleep still in your eyes, before you have had a chance to arrange yourself. He offers you the glass, you look, you see amour propre there, doing what it does, and then, and this is the move the cynics who love him always miss, you are free. Not free because you have become a better person. Not free because the self-love has been purged or overcome or replaced with something purer. Free because you are no longer surprised by it. You are no longer spending energy maintaining a story about your own motives that does not quite fit. The gap between the story and the truth is where anxiety lives. When the story and the truth come close enough to each other, the anxiety goes quiet. Not all at once. Gradually. The way a room becomes easier to move through once you know where the furniture is. There is a maxim somewhere in the range of number 40 that offers what might be the most honest thing in the entire book. Interest, which blinds some, enlightens others. He is saying that self-interest is not uniformly a distorter. For some, the desire for gain or advantage closes the eyes. For others, exactly the same force sharpens them. Because when you stand to lose something, you see the situation with remarkable clarity. Amour propre is an engine, and engines are neutral. What they produce depends on what you do with them. This is the proof he offers inside the book itself that the engine he has been describing for 400 and more maxims is not a demon. It is a mechanism. It can be turned toward use. And there is more in that maxim than people notice. He is also saying that self-knowledge, real self-knowledge, not the performed kind, can itself become the thing that enlightens you. When you stop being blind to your own interest, when you can see that the praise you receive for a generous act pleases you more than you want to admit, when you notice that the small fault you confessed in company last Tuesday was carefully chosen for its smallness, when you can see that machine working, you have something. You have the beginning of honesty. And honesty, for La Rochefoucauld, is the rarest of the things he could name, because it requires you to be willing to be seen without the costume. Rest here for a moment if you would like. Breathe in slowly. Notice the weight of you against wherever you are lying, the way the body settles, the way the breath moves without you directing it. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. When you are ready, we will continue together. We were speaking of honesty, and of what it costs. The trap that comes after reading La Rochefoucauld carelessly is not cynicism. Exactly, it is a different kind of vanity. The trap is this: you read him, you feel the sting. You recognize your own amour propre in one of the surgical lines, and then you take a kind of dark pride in your recognizing. You tell yourself you are among the honest few who have faced the truth. You begin, quietly, to feel superior to the people who still believe in the flattering story about themselves. And in that moment, you have become exactly what he described. You have used self-knowledge as another costume for amour propre. You are now the enlightened realist, and your enlightenment is the new vanity. He saw this too. Maxim 138, we would rather speak ill of ourselves than not talk about ourselves at all. Even running yourself down keeps you at the center. Even the performance of unflattering honesty is a performance. Self-hatred, to the extent it is loud and articulate and on display, is not the opposite of amour propre. It is one of its most elaborate masks. The move he is pointing toward is quieter than that. It does not perform itself. It is not a story you tell about how clear-eyed you are. It is more like what happens after you stop telling a story, the pause that follows. When the narration has run out and you are simply present with what is actually there, without needing it to be better or worse than it is. You helped someone today, or this past week, or at some moment in the recent past that you can still feel. The help was real. The other person was genuinely aided. And somewhere in the undertow of it there was also the mild warmth of being seen as kind. The small relief of having done the right thing so that you could count yourself among the people who do the right thing, the faint pleasure of your own virtue. All of that was present. And the help was still real. This is what he is offering. Not the demolition of the good thing, the accurate account of it. The good thing and the mixed motive, occupying the same moment, which is what most moments actually look like when you examine them without the flattering light on. Virtue, then, is vanity that has learned good manners. He did not write that line exactly, but it is a faithful translation of what he spent a book saying. Vanity, amour propre, has studied the world long enough to learn that generosity is rewarded, that kindness earns gratitude, that honesty wins trust. And so it puts on those forms, it wears them reliably over years in the way that turns a habit into a character. And the question he is asking, in the quiet underneath all the maxims, is, at what point does wearing the form long enough become the thing itself? He does not answer that. He leaves it open. But the crucial point, the point that saves this from nihilism and from the trap of the cynics who love him, is that manners still matter. The form still matters. The person who is kind because it flatters their self-image produces real kindness in the world. The one who gives because giving makes them feel generous produces a real gift. Purity of motive is not required for goodness of effect. And goodness of effect, reliably, year after year, in the texture of how you treat the people around you, that is most of what we mean when we call someone a good person. Not the immaculate interior, the consistent, actual behaviour. The theologians at Port Royal, the Jansenists whose severity underwrote his whole project, might have disagreed. They were after the soul, not the surface. They wanted the root, not the fruit. But La Rochefoucauld, for all that their Augustinian view of fallen nature saturated his thinking, was not writing theology. He was writing about life as it is lived, in drawing rooms and on battlefields, and in the long, ordinary corridors of other people's company. And in those places, the fruit is what you can see and taste and be nourished by or harmed by. The root is always partly hidden. He knew that better than almost anyone. His afterlife tells you something about the size of what he uncovered. Voltaire, who admired almost nothing without a corresponding scepticism, admitted that the maxims had done something real for French prose, had helped to form its taste for precision, its intolerance of vague flourish, its discipline of the sentence. That is not a small thing. Voltaire was not generous with praise, and precision of thought was, for him, a serious moral category. To credit La Rochefoucauld with shaping how the French mind learned to sentence itself is to say he shaped how generations of people learned to think. And then, a century and more later, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche read the French moralists La Rochefoucauld, La Bruyère, Chamfort, the way a musician listens to a predecessor who solved a problem they are still working on. He said so, in Human, All Too Human, and elsewhere. He called them masters of the psychological maxim. And what he took from them, what he built into his own project of unmasking the hidden motives behind moral claims. The idea that lofty ideals are clothing for humbler drives, that what presents itself as virtue is often will to power or resentment, or the desire for superiority in a new costume, all of that is downstream of the maxims. Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, 200 years after La Rochefoucauld, is the long form of what the Duke did in a short sentence. The suspicion of moral motive that has become almost a background assumption of modern thought, the reflex of asking what is really going on underneath the stated reason. It flows, in significant part, from the Paris drawing rooms of the 1660s, from a wounded aristocrat and his circle of sharp-tongued salon companions, sharpening sentences for sport and arriving, one sentence at a time, at something that would take philosophy 2 centuries to absorb. He is also, scholars of the moralists tend to agree, one of the first practitioners of what we now call depth psychology, the intuition that we do not know our own real reasons, that the surface account of why we did something is not the same as the actual mechanism underneath. Freud gave that intuition a vocabulary, a theory, a set of technical terms. La Rochefoucauld simply observed it, in himself and in the people around him, and compressed it into a line. The unconscious, as an idea, did not arrive fully formed with psychoanalysis. It was being described, sentence by careful sentence, in a book of maxims that fit in your coat pocket. But the tradition was not without its honest dissenters. Vauvenagus, Luc de Clapiès, Marquis de Vauvenagus, writing in the 18th century in the same moralist vein, explicitly pushed back. He defended the passions. He argued that genuine feeling, genuine generosity, genuine sympathy exist in the human heart and cannot be reduced to amour propre without losing something true. He was not naive. He had read La Rochefoucauld carefully enough to disagree with him carefully. His dissent was not ignorance, it was a genuine counter-position, held by someone who found the relentless reduction of virtue to self-love incomplete, even dishonest in its own way. He thought La Rochefoucauld left too little room for the real good that people do, sometimes, when they are not thinking about themselves at all. That debate is still open. The philosopher C. Daniel Batson ran experiments in the 20th century that La Rochefoucauld could never have run. He studied what happens when people feel genuine empathy, when they take the perspective of another person who is suffering, when they feel what the other is feeling rather than merely observing it from the outside. What he found, across a series of careful studies, is that empathy produced helping behavior that was not adequately explained by self-interest or by the desire to relieve the discomfort of witnessing suffering. It looked, under his conditions, like something that was genuinely other-directed, like care for the other person rather than care for one's own sense of being a caring person. He called it the empathy altruism hypothesis, that genuine altruism, other-directed motivation, exists in human beings and is activated by empathic concern. This does not prove La Rochefoucauld wrong. Batson's findings are contested, as serious findings tend to be, and amour propre, as the Duke described it, is subtle enough to operate even inside feelings that seem other-directed. But the scientific record, at this point, is honest about its uncertainty. Modern psychology did not confirm him. It found the question he was asking, is any act truly selfless, to be alive, and genuinely difficult? It did not come back with a verdict, which, if you read him carefully, is exactly what Le Plus Souvent predicts. There is also James Andreoni, an economist who studied charitable giving and found that a significant portion of the pleasure people take in giving comes from what he called the warm glow, an internal reward that has to do with feeling generous, with the good image of oneself that comes from writing the check or dropping the coin or showing up for someone in need. He called this impure altruism, a gift that feels genuinely good to give, partly because of what giving it says about the giver. That warm glow is amour propre, dressed in a sweater. And Andreoni was not saying the gift does not count. He was saying the gift and the glow coexist, which is the Duke's position in a graph. And then there is what we have come to call virtue signalling, a phrase that arrived in our vocabulary somewhere in the 2010s to describe the way people publicly perform moral positions in a way that is as much about their social standing as about the position itself. The declaration on social media, the careful public alignment with the correct cause, the expressed outrage that functions, at least partly, as reputation management, as a signal to the people around you about which side of a line you stand on. La Rochefoucauld did not have a hashtag, but he described the mechanism. He described it in Maxim 2:18, hypocrisy as the tribute vice pays to virtue, and in Maxim 3:27, small faults confessed to forestall suspicion of great ones. He simply did not have a name for the digital version. We gave it one. The mechanism is 400 years old, at least. There is something oddly freeing in that. If the mechanism is that old, then it is not a sign of the particular corruption of this moment, this culture, this generation. It is a sign of what human beings have always done when they are social creatures who care what others think of them, which is to say, when they are human. Amour-propre is not a pathology of modernity. It is a feature of the species, and a feature, unlike a flaw, can be understood, accounted for, worked with. You do not need to be cured of being human. You simply need to see it clearly enough that you are not permanently fooled. He wrote 504 maxims. He revised them across 5 editions in 13 years. He cut the most complete picture he ever drew of amour-propre, the long, living portrait that described it as exceeding even the deceptions we practice on others, that he had pressed into that first 1665 edition and then quietly removed. He cut it not because he disbelieved it, but because a picture that complete leaves no room for the reader. The reader needs room. The reader needs space to find their own angle on the glass. He made space in the removing. And in the last years of his life, the last decade, after the Fronde was over and the wound in his eyes had healed and the political ambitions had collapsed into the much smaller, stranger ambition of getting a sentence right, he was at the centre of something different. He was close, very close, to Madame de Lafayette, Marie Madeleine Pioche de la Vergne, who would publish in 1678, the same year as the 5th and final edition of the Maxims, a novel called La Princesse de Clèves. It is sometimes called the first modern psychological novel, a story about a woman who is honest with herself about her own desire, who refuses the consoling fiction that her feelings are other than they are, and who pays the full price of that honesty in a world that prefers the comfortable story. The friendship between La Rochefoucauld and Madame de Lafayette, documented and lasting, is not an accident. They were doing the same thing in different forms. He in the compressed sentence, she in the unfolding story. Both in pursuit of the same thing, the accurate account of what actually happens inside a person. The same year, the same question, the scalpel and the novel appearing together. And Madame de Sablé's salon, where it had all begun, where the maxims had been composed and traded and sharpened like blades among aristocrats competing for the truest sentence, that circle had included, in its Jansenist periphery, people who were genuinely grappling with the question of what a fallen human being could honestly claim about their own goodness. Not to punish the claim, to understand it, to hold it up to the light and see what it was actually made of. That is the tradition he was standing in. That is the tradition he helped make. And now, here, in this quiet, in the particular darkness of this particular night, it comes to you. not as a system, not as a set of instructions for examining your motives at breakfast, not as a course of self-improvement or a method or a challenge, just as a light, held at a particular angle, that shows you something that was always there. You have done kind things that you are also pleased to have people notice. You have confessed faults that were small enough to confess safely. You have felt, at the edge of someone else's difficulty, the mild comfort of not being in that difficulty yourself, and somewhere in the watching from the outside there was also the warmth of being the kind of person who shows up. All of this was true. All of it happened. And the kindness was still kindness. The showing up was still real. The person who was helped did not receive less because you also, somewhere in the undertow, received something. This is not a reason for despair. This is not even a reason for guilt. It is, at most, a reason for a small, specific honesty with yourself in the private hours when no one is watching and you do not need the story to be flattering. You can look at the mixed thing and see it as mixed. You can hold the generous act and the warm glow together in the same hand and let them both be what they are. That is the freedom he is pointing toward. Not the freedom of having purified your motives, not the freedom of having become the kind of person whose kindness runs on pristine, selfless fuel. That freedom is not available to us most of the time. He was honest enough to say so, and precise enough to say most of the time, and that precision is the whole gift. The freedom he is pointing toward is quieter. It is the freedom of the person who has stopped spending energy on a story that does not fit. The energy that goes into maintaining the flattering account, into not noticing that the small fault you confessed was chosen for its smallness, into not noticing that the advice you gave so freely was also a pleasure to give because it felt good to know the answer. That energy, when you stop spending it, goes somewhere. It does not disappear. It simply becomes available for something else, for noticing the actual texture of things, for being present with someone in a way that is not entirely about the image of yourself being present, for, occasionally, something that actually approaches the genuine. La Rochefoucauld never claimed to be there himself. He never wrote the maxim that said, "And here is how, having seen the engine, you replace it with something purer." He knew better. You do not replace the engine. You learn to drive it with your eyes open. Philosophy triumphs over evils past and evils to come. But present evils triumph over philosophy. Even his detachment had limits. Even his clarity could not hold against the actual moment of pain or fear or wanting. He included himself in the picture. He drew the glass, and then he looked into it. That is the act, not the conclusions he reached, not the particular maxims that cut most cleanly, but the act itself. The willingness to look. The decision that looking, even when what you find is not flattering, is better than the alternative. The alternative being the permanent, exhausting, quietly anxious occupation of not looking, of maintaining a self that needs constant flattery and is provided it most efficiently by the greatest flatterer it will ever meet, which is its own self-love. The scalpel, in the end, was not a weapon. It was a gift. He offered it without sentimentality, without warmth in any conventional sense, without the reassurance that you would like what you found. He offered it in the way that only someone who has already used it on himself can, with the particular steadiness of someone who has already seen the difficult thing and is still here, still writing, still revising, still sharpening, edition by edition, the sentence that tries to be exactly true. He finished the 5th edition in 1678. He died in 1680. He was 66 years old. He had been shot through the face, he had lost his war, he had watched his world diminish into an elegant room full of clever people and careful sentences, and he had found in that diminishment, not despite it, but through it, the material for something that outlasted everything else he had done. The battles, the conspiracies, the wounded pride of the Fronde, all of it is history now, the kind of history you need a footnote to explain, but the sentence about self-love being the greatest of all flatterers, that needs no footnote. It walks into the room and it sits down and it says, "You know this. You have always known this. You simply needed someone to say it in a way that made you stop pretending you did not." Voltaire knew it. Nietzsche knew it and said so. Vauvenargues knew it well enough to argue with it. Madame de Lafayette knew it and built a novel out of the same knowledge. And somewhere in the tradition that flows from the Paris salons of the 1660s into the vocabulary of modern psychology, the self-serving bias, the warm glow, the empathy-altruism debate that Daniel Batson kept honestly open. Somewhere in all of that, the insight persists, reshaped, renamed, tested and contested and refined, but still, at its root, the same. We are not entirely transparent to ourselves. Our motives are mixed, our goodness is real, and it runs on a hidden engine, and both things are true at once. And seeing that, really seeing it, not as a condemnation, but as a description, is the beginning of something that, if it is not freedom exactly, is the closest thing available to it. Let the thoughts, if they come and pass. You do not need to hold them. You do not need to carry this man's conclusions into the morning, or remember which maxim said what, or be able to cite the 1678 edition at breakfast. None of that is required. The knowing that comes through in the dark is not the kind that needs to be carried. It settles somewhere. It takes up residence without asking. What he gave, what he spent his later years, blinded and diminished and still precise, trying to give, was simply the honest view. The glass without the flattering light. And whether you find, looking into it, more self-love than you expected or less, whether you find the engine running as he described, or find that Vauvenargues was right, and there is something more generous than that working in you sometimes, what matters is that you looked. The courage of looking is not small. In a world that offers flattery at every turn, that rewards the comfortable story. That provides 1,000 small mechanisms for not noticing what is actually driving you, the decision to look quietly, without punishment and without performance, is the most Rochefoucauldian thing you can do. Not because it makes you better, not because it makes you worse, because it makes you honest. And honesty, however uncomfortable it arrives, tends to make you more at peace, in the long run, than the flattering story ever managed. He knew this. A man shot through both eyes, who then spent his life helping people to see. He knew what sight was worth. And you are here, in the quiet, having spent some time with his sentences, having let a few of them land wherever they land, and you can put them down now. You can let the night do what nights do, which is to soften the sharp edges of whatever the day was made of, and let the breath slow and the body remember that it knows how to rest. The maxims will still be there. The question of your own motives will still be there, patient and available, whenever you want to look again. It asks nothing of you tonight. It simply offers the glass, quietly, and leaves it where you can find it. We have been together a long while in this hour. We have met a man whose face was crossed by a bullet and whose vision was threatened, and who chose, in what remained, to write about sight. We have met the word le plus souvent, most often. That is the whole difference between a diagnosis and a verdict. We have met amour propre, the greatest of all flatterers, the engine inside the kindest act, the creature that deceives even itself. We have met the salon, where the cruelty was a game, and the theology that was underneath the game, and the men and women who were thinking the same thought in different rooms. We have met the suppressed portrait, cut from the book to leave room for you. We have met virtue as vanity that learned good manners, and the news that manners still matter. We have met the question that science did not settle, the warm glow and the genuinely other-directed act, and the honest uncertainty between them, and we have met the quiet at the end of the question, where certainty is not required, and honesty is enough. You do not need to remember any of it. If one line stayed, if one small thing shifted in the way you will hold your own motives when you next notice them, if tomorrow you feel the warm glow of a generous act and simply nod at it without needing to pretend it isn't there, that is the whole of what was offered here. That is enough. And if nothing stayed at all, if it all dissolved into the dark, the way things do when sleep comes, that is also enough. You listened. You were here. The sentences passed through, and the night passed through, and that is what nights are for. Sleep now, if you are ready. The thinking can stop. The day has been whatever it was, and you have been in it, with your mixed motives and your genuine care and your amour propre, doing its quiet work alongside everything else, the way it always has and always will, the way it did for everyone who ever held this book or sat in that drawing room or lay awake in the dark with a question about what was actually driving them. You are in excellent company. You always were. One last sleepy beep before the dark. Good night.